Hello and welcome to today's webcast, Resilient Supply Chains, How to Dynamically Manage Risk, Opportunity, and Business Continuity. Today's event is hosted by IHS, the leading provider of global supply chain information and analytics. My name is Rory King, Director of IHS Supply Chain, and I'll be host and moderator for today's presentation. Thank you so much for attending. We're happy to have you joining us here today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. We want today's event to be informative, so feel free to ask questions at any time. To do so, type questions in the Ask a Question area to the bottom right and click Submit. Just be aware that the slides advance automatically for you throughout the event, and if you need help, click the Help icon below. Also, feel free to join the conversation on Twitter today during today's webcast. You can join us live in live tweeting with the hashtag IHSWebcast, and that's webcast, singular. And last but not least, the most important housekeeping item for us. We have created a survey with questions about today's event and topics that we'd like to ask you to provide us with feedback throughout today's event. Your feedback is very instrumental in helping us not only improve our events, but also our market knowledge and our products and services. As a token of our appreciation, IHS is offering everyone who completes today's survey a chance to win a Kindle Fire HD. So please complete the survey, which can be found at the bottom of the webcast console via the survey icon. And now for today's presentation. We will be hearing first from Mr. Gene Long. Gene Long is Vice President, Supply Chain Consulting, IHS Supply Chain Solutions. Gene Long is Vice President of our Supply Chain Consulting business, where he focuses on supply chain operations of private and public service clients in the energy, chemicals, manufacturing, and transportation industries. Gene has a very accomplished 40-year career where he served as an operations executive, including key positions such as Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Development for Cardinal Health, Founder and President of UPS Consulting, President and COO of SiteStuff, and also Founder and President of BAX Global. He was also Dell's first Director of Worldwide Logistics. Throughout his career, Gene has been actively engaged in supply chains throughout the world, including the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Often sought after as an advisor by organizations in both the private and public sectors, he's a very recognized thought leader in supply chain strategy and operations. Thanks for joining us and welcome today, Gene. Following Gene, we'll hear from Howard Rappaport. Howard will lead discussion on taking a look at chemical supply chain scenarios and their implications. Howard serves as the Senior Director of Chemicals at IHS and is currently responsible for the chemicals and plastics content within IHS Supply Chain Pricing and Purchasing Service. Howard has almost more than 30 years experience in the chemicals and plastics industry. He is also sought after as an industry speaker and has been included in various publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Financial Times, Fortune Magazine, Forbes Magazine, Bloomberg, NPR, and the BBC, among others. Welcome, Howard. And finally, we will hear from Mr. Ryland Maltzbarger. Ryland will lead discussion that takes a look at food supply, weather volatility, and their implications on global supply chains. In 2008, Ryland assumed a leadership position as principal economist of the IHS Agriculture Service. He's widely regarded as a leading agriculture and food chain expert, having responsibility for IHS crop and livestock services, as well as numerous other forecasts that he and his team lead, including sugar and cotton. Welcome, Ryland. And with that, I'd like to get started and turn things over to Gene. Mr. Gene Long, take it away.
Thanks, Rory. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're looking forward to sharing with you our perspective on the creation of strategies and then operational resilient supply chains. In terms of setting the context, I think it's important that we spend a few minutes talking about what supply chain management is to the broad audience we have here. There are many, many definitions of what that could be. We want to take a few minutes to narrow down the focus a bit so that we're talking in the same context. It's interesting to note that by increasing the focus on risk within the last 3 to 5 years that we have seen an executive agenda emerging that's going to make this, we think, a more and more cogent topic for senior management throughout the public and the private sector in years to come. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the nature of business continuity, and we're going to talk about how that will evolve, we believe, very firmly into the creation of what we are now calling resilient supply chains. So what is supply chain management? To all the professionals and the practitioners that are on the call this morning, I'm sure each of you has a very, very clear definition of what that means in your enterprise and in your organization. We're going to take a little bit different tact as we go today to give us some room, I think, to explore some options about how we improve the state of that art known as supply chain management. If you take a look at what supply chains really are, or more broadly speaking, if you take a look at what comprises a value chain, it's an interconnected series of entities, organizations, regulatory bodies that make things happen between some ultimate source and some ultimate consumer. So a way to think about a supply chain is that fundamentally it's a method of collaborating horizontally among members in a chain. The chain's objective being creating some product or some service at the outcome that will benefit a group of consumers or users. I think a second consideration is that if you will consider the optimization of supply chains, not in the mechanical sense, but in the sense that for a supply chain to work, that supply chain has to be synchronized. Then the idea of optimization simply means that all the players are playing equally well with each other to get things done. Lastly, we think that supply chain management really is all about interconnected decision making, considered in its broadest context, from product conception and design through manufacturability, through actual manufacturing, through distribution, through delivery, and even in reverse logistics. There are a number of decisions that have to happen all the time, on time, in a way that actually makes the supply chain perform in the way that we want it to. There's an implication here that basically says if the supply chain works well, it's going to do a great job. However, we've spent the last decade and a half, at least that long, maybe even the last 20 years as supply chain management professionals, making sure that we're running exceptionally efficient supply chains. Well, what does that really mean in plain language? It means that we have built supply chains that do their jobs in profoundly timely and cost-efficient ways. It means they do a really good job of reaching across the globe and moving information and content and product where we need it, when we need it, hopefully for the right price. But it also means if something goes wrong, and I'm not going to qualify what the something is at this point, but if something does go wrong in the supply chain, if we encounter a disruptive event, we could have big problems. If you consider, as the World Economic Forum has done, that we're probably living in the most complex and interdependent connection that we've seen in human history, that we're presented with some pretty large challenges as supply chain operators to make sure that our supply chains can meet change for the good or for the bad. So it's both disruptive and opportunistic, that does so in a way that continues to support our supply chain from the source to the consumer, and does it in a way that is somewhat more agile. So a theme that you're going to hear us dwell on throughout the presentation and the discussions this morning is, what happens when something doesn't go as planned? What happens when something doesn't go as perceived it should? The whole idea that you'll hear us touch again and again is that the achievement of resilient supply chains really comes down to the ability to be agile, to be able to change, and to be able to respond very quickly when there is a threat. So is there a sudden emergence of risk awareness in today's supply chain world? I would offer to you that it's probably not very sudden. I would offer to you that we've been dealing with supply chain threats to business continuity for a long, long time. But I would also observe, without getting into the academic argument that's raging today about whether we actually have more risk, that the interconnectedness that we all experience in how our supply chains work with all the partners that we interact with routinely across the world is probably a great deal more intense today than it was 10 to 15 years ago. We've seen a number of the techniques and approaches that have been used to make our supply chains exceptionally efficient also serve to make them somewhat fragile. A good example might be the reliance on long-term or long-distance outsourcing. There are many arguments for and against, and I don't think anyone could argue successfully against the benefit that appropriate outsourcing makes. But when you start to consider the length of the supply chains, the complexity of the supply chains in terms of national boundaries crossed, the timing or performance in those supply chains, there's a counter-argument that says maybe that's an element of fragility that we need to take another look at. Our discussion today is really going to talk about the evolution of where we have been in managing business continuity through the performance of our supply chains. That continuity, we think, is better than it was a number of years ago, but not where it needs to be to meet the challenges that are on the table for supply chain managers today and those challenges that are likely to emerge in the future. So the increased focus upon risk has really evolved, we think, from a couple of things. There are many, many natural disasters, the headlines that we read about, that have impacted companies on a global basis. Many of those are very frequent, as we saw on the last slide, and they are impactive. The second thing that we would note is that companies are now beginning, institutions and organizations are now beginning to understand the financial impact and the brand impact that a disruptive event can have on their businesses. As a consequence, risk management across the value chain is becoming an executive agenda item. It's no longer relegated to the operating staff in most businesses and organizations. It is now an issue that has to take on, if you will, board-level dimensions because of the impacts, because of the impacts that unmanaged disruptions might take. So if we take a look at risk in the context of really what is it, I think it has two constituent parts from our perspective here at IHS. First, there are threats, and then there's a level of vulnerability to that threat. I'll expand on that in just a moment, but fundamentally, if you take the threats and sum them up and individually recognize their percentage participation, if you will, as vulnerabilities within your particular supply chain, you can start to quantify the level of risk that your company faces or your institution faces. The risks that we normally address are those that are both natural and man-made. But we'd like to point out to you that it's not just the headline risks that impact your business. The other risks that we have to be able to see and understand are those within your own enterprise, certainly, but as well the ones that are related to local infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, power, labor supplies, think in those terms, that will affect both your first and second tier suppliers as well as your own operations. There are geopolitical issues that can have very real impacts on your supply chain, just as regulatory requirements and fluctuations in the financial markets can have. The position that we're going to offer to you this morning is that what we see in risk profiles today among most of our customers and the folks that we work with as our clients is that they can do a very good job of creating a risk profile about what just happened. So what am I saying in plain words? The risk profiles that we see today tend to be static snapshots. It's a picture of what happened yesterday and to some period in the past that describes then existing conditions or the current conditions at that point in time. What we're going to address as we move forward is the idea that business continuity planning really can't depend completely on a historical snapshot. What we need to be able to do if we're going to truly understand, avoid, mitigate, and recover from disruptive events in the supply chain is the impacted areas that offer us the highest degree of vulnerability as a business. The graphic that you're currently seeing now basically says that there are, as no surprise to you, a collection of external partners. There are elements within your own enterprise that come together, work together to give you a continuous supply through your value chain. The list here may impress you as pretty expansive, but we want to be very clear that we believe a holistic approach is necessary in understanding both your risk and the vulnerability that you have to risk as you start to go down the path from recovery to business continuity to ultimately the operation of a resilient supply chain. When we look at assuring business continuity, we really want to move along a path that lets us detect and deter risk before we actually encounter them. That's the most preferable state of being. If we can't do that, and in some cases we won't be able to do that, then we have to understand what we're going to do to mitigate or minimize the impact of that risk on our business operations. And hand in hand with mitigation, we need to understand clearly what the concise plans for responding are so that we can recover. The fact of the matter is, we do not believe that any supply chain out there that we've ever encountered is risk-free. And we've hopefully made the case so far in the discussion that the risk may be increasing simply because of the degree of connectedness that your value chains have today. Recovery is where we have to focus at the end of this entire cycle, because the maintenance of shareholder value, the maintenance of short-term profit, and maybe even long-term brand image can be damaged by how long it takes to get things fixed, to recover when there is a supply chain disruption. When we take a look at assuring business continuity, we spend a fair amount of time understanding the risks and then understanding, probably more importantly, what is the degree of vulnerability that you actually have in your network? How will a threat impact your people, your processes, your technology, your infrastructure, and maybe even your economic circumstances? We think it's very important to understand that there are risks that simply cannot be managed or mitigated. There are other risks that can be mitigated, and then to the the left-hand side of the Chevron scale, there are probably risks that can be avoided if there's enough foreknowledge as to what's going on in the environment where your supply chain does in fact operate. If you take a look at the graph that we have here, it's pretty clear, I think, intuitively to most of us that the value that your enterprise gets from being prepared and able to quickly recover increases as the reactive response goes down. Let me be clear about that. In many instances, at the far left-hand side of the curve that you see on the graphic here, we find that customers and clients are still somewhat unprepared. Those that are not unprepared tend to have contingency planning in place, but there could be questions about what to do when an event occurs to make that plan real, to realize it and to take it into action. Others have evolved to the point that they have disaster recovery plans in place and are able to mobilize the resources and the people across their value chains to get things moving once there has been a disruption. Somewhere toward the middle of the curve, we'll find many companies that are basically prepared for continuous operation. That is a very positive benchmark, and it usually means that there is a very robust business continuity plan in place that allows that company to act quickly and act decisively when they detect or incur a disruptive event in the supply chain. What that really means, they know who the people are that are accountable. Those people have authority and jurisdiction to make the changes and the calls for action in the supply chain that are necessary, and they can do this quickly because there's been a great deal of forethought put into what that plan looks like. All of that's very positive. But we think the next step in the evolution of supply chain operations is to reach a place where you're actually resilient, What that means to us is that you've actually hardened, to use the military terminology, you've actually hardened your operations against any foreseeable emergency that might arise. Keywords foreseeable. That takes us to what we believe is the next logical step in the evolution of supply chain continuity. It becomes a focus on not just understanding what just happened, looking in the rearview mirror, if you will, and saying things were okay up through lunch or yesterday. It's the ability to look a bit around the curve, to look out into the future and anticipate when certain environmental factors, and I'm using environment in a very broad sense here, when certain environmental factors, whether they're economic, geopolitical, supplier-based, any of the things that you might think about could actually be detected and managed before there was a disruptive event on the supply chain or any of the constituents within that supply chain. If you take a look at what Gartner told us about the top performing supply chains last year, it really bears out a lot of what we discussed up to this point. Resiliency, in the sense that Gartner has seen it among many, many companies that it's talked to, comes down to the ability to sense and respond. Now that implies that you're doing something greater than, better than, you can use your own adjective here, but an improvement over see and react. Remember that the evolution of business continuity that we've talked about so far basically gets some of the leading practitioners in supply chain management to a point where they've got great business recovery plans. The idea that's coming now to the forefront in executive thinking is that I have to do better than that, and I have to be able to sense and respond so that I don't ever have a disruptive event. Now, clearly, there are certain things that can happen, natural disasters, calamities, economic collapses that are far beyond the control of any one of us in terms of managing our supply chain. However, what Gartner has been able to confirm is that the leaders in supply chain management out there are beginning to look at a couple of ways to get to the place where they can sense and respond. One of those is to make sure that their supply chains, although they're efficient, although they're fast, are as simple as possible. That's the other way of saying take out complexity. And that means taking out steps in the supply chain or partners in the supply chain that may not be adding significant value to the end customer. The last observation, probably the most important one, in my opinion, is that the leaders in supply chain management, in relation to keeping their businesses alive in the face of disruption, are learning how to be very, very responsive. They're learning how to move quickly and to overcome the organizational or bureaucratic inertia that sometimes slows down responses to disruptive events. So Gartner's telling us the leaders are already worried about sensing and responding. We're going to spend some time in the balance of our discussion this morning talking about what that really means. How do you sense and respond? It begins to sound like we're trying to forecast the future in totality, and that's really not the case. However, we do want to be able to talk about the things that can be done within reason, within fact, within current capability to help you get there. So our perspective here at IHS on a resilient supply chain is pretty straightforward. If you want to dynamically manage risk within supply chain operations, it's important that you get to a place where your supply chain operation is truly resilient. Now, that's going to encompass, at minimum, understanding and working with the viability of your suppliers, where they are, how you're working with them, how you're interconnected, and how they are prepared to meet disruptive challenge. It's going to probably mean a deeper understanding of the basic commodities, materials, and components that are flowing through the various tiers of your supply chain. It's certainly going to mean understanding at the discrete part or commodity level what you're doing. It's probably going to mean that you have to have a much better insight into the global infrastructure that lets things move to you. If, in fact, as a point, you don't consider your primary and secondary logistics network links as vital to the continuity of your supply chain planning today, then you could be in for a nasty surprise. Last but not least, we think it's very, very important to start looking at, in resilient supply chain design, it's very important to start looking at those elements of supply chain performance, call them processes or call them KPI leaders, if you will, but those elements of performance that can, in fact, be augmented or extended or forecasted by using other indices from the marketplace. Last but not least, we do believe that you have to go through the rigorous process of understanding your risks, ranking those risks, and then understanding with their ranking being driven by vulnerability, you have to understand exactly what you want to do first and what you want to do last. The priority for everything else in the middle will become, I believe, secondary. In a recent survey that we conducted, it's interesting to learn when you in particular think about value chains that are moving materials, and most of us are concerned with those kinds of value chains, that the decision on sourcing of important things, whether it's commodities or services, is top of mind for many people when they think about business continuity. In terms of resiliency, it was interesting for us to understand that an awful lot of folks believe, almost 82% of those respondents, as you can see here, believe that supply chain risk is increasing. And within that same survey body, we found out that an awful lot of people said, you know what, I'm multi-sourced on my key problem or my key commodity or my key supplier, so I don't have a problem. But then the numbers drop pretty drastically when you start looking at how many of those same people are actually looking beyond their Tier 1 supply base and looking at what's going on with the materials, meaning the countries, the places, and the regions from which this stuff comes. The number falls down to 60%, not much more than half. And then when we start thinking about the other drivers of the risk to a commodity that might be through a multi-source supply base, the attention falls off even more. And again, I would offer that most of the folks who know early that there's going to be a problem with, let's say, a change in the labor base or a change in the regulatory environment toward the bottom of the pyramid that's in front of you now, are able to move more concisely, more quickly, and much more effectively to the place where their suppliers are not going to be endangered by, or at least minimize the danger to their suppliers when there are changes in the basic flow of commodity and material and data and information that keeps a business alive. Our approach here at IHS to supply chain resiliency really boils down to helping companies and institutions take a look at their operations, take a look at the strategies around those operations in a way that tests the resiliency. We start with the premise that most supply chains that we will encounter with our customers are to some extent fragile or vulnerable, if you choose to use that word, and they're usually pretty efficient. However, we also start with the premise that if the focus of business continuity has not been a top executive agenda item, there is probably a fair amount of room to look at how to become more responsive and adaptive in operating that supply chain. The value that having the value chain global view in mind brings is very, very high. We believe that most supply chains at one level or another, automotive industry as an example, connected to the chemical industry to an example as connected to the energy sector, are all interconnected at some level because of the linkages of the product flows and the commodities through those various networks. So our look, our take, our perspective, if you will, is to begin with an aggregate view of how things are moving through interconnected supply chains, and then help drill that down as insight and forecastable information that our customers can use to build a resilient supply chain, fundamentally one that, as a reminder, is sensing and responding to signals from the environment, not only the enterprise environment, the enterprise supply chain, but also the external environment that houses all of those operations. We also take the perspective that's very, very important to look at your entire network as a supply chain, and understand how it's put together and performing as a global enterprise, as a global entity. That's where the risk will be identified, and that's where we think the resiliency can come in. Because if you'll go back to Gartner's earlier comments, very important to take out complexity you don't need and to look for additional efficiencies as you go through. So don't take into your thinking today from our comments that all this means go spend a whole lot more money on making my supply chain move slower. That's not the issue. The target in mind is to actually keep the efficiency, but make sure that we know where the potential bumps are and to manage those accordingly. How do we do this? We suggest that a supply chain practitioner who wants to have a resilient supply chain absolutely needs to get through a fundamental mapping process. And, I don't want to make anybody yawn out loud here, but at the end of the day, it's important that you know physically where your suppliers are, where your facilities are, the infrastructure that links those facilities, the people that operate those facilities and infrastructure points, and of course the processes that they're using. All sounds really huge and probably unmanageable. Really isn't. If you take it at the appropriate level of detail, it's possible to go through and understand where your physical nodes are. It is possible to understand what the risk profile, use that word literally, the risk profile at some moment in time, would be for each of the node operators in that network. And then it's going to be possible, we think, to assign a risk value based on the vulnerability of one risk over another. I know I've used that term vulnerability throughout the discussion this morning, and I want to be very clear that we think vulnerability is going to be variable. Dependent on who you are and what you're doing within your supply chain, it is completely possible that what may be a real threat to me is a secondary or even a tertiary threat to you. It's important to understand that based on where your network is and how it's configured today. So the first step that we take, clearly, is to exhaustively map its supply chain from a risk perspective. We want to understand what could hurt you and how badly it could hurt you if it occurred. So it's all about the risk and the vulnerability so that we understand what to focus on to become resilient. Resiliency really emerges by doing one simple but fairly complex task. Resiliency comes from the ability to establish a listing, a ranking of those key performance indicators for your enterprise or for your business or for your institution that is most meaningful. So let me say that very plainly. Think in your mind of a dashboard. Think of a dashboard in the automobile. It has a limited number of instruments on it for a simple reason. You can't monitor everything about the vehicle through the dashboard all the time. It's not a possibility. So there has to be a ranking. It's important to know, as a for instance, how fast you're going. So give me a speedometer. It's important to know how much mileage you're getting. So give me a gas gauge. You get the picture. By going through a vulnerability risk assessment, it is possible to start narrowing down the KPIs or the key performance indicators or the process indicators that are most important to the resilience of your supply chain. When that decision is made, then we start to look at and apply information that usually comes from outside your enterprise. Think about things like economics. Think about things like country and regional infrastructure. Think about things like geopolitical risk. We basically need to get those things tied into the discussion early to start building some insight around where it would go. So here's an idea. If you want to actually get to a dashboard that means something, a dashboard that's forward-looking, you basically have to start moving to the integration of your operating information, what's most important to you, your operating risks, as we would identify in a risk mitigation profiling exercise, and then tying that to the external factors that help you look forward so that you do not get caught short in many cases by routine changes in the environment. What we're going to do at this point is to try to give you a bird's eye view of some very real examples in terms of how that dashboard might look and how the dashboard can help you look forward into a resilient supply chain that is actually set up to sense and respond to changes in the environment. And with that, I will hand the controls to Howard.
Thank you, Gene, and welcome to everybody on the call. Gene did an excellent job of giving us the overview of the big picture, the infrastructure on how to set these up. And I thought what we'd do here in the few moments that I've got as part of this presentation is to take you down to the ground level and give you a perspective on what these situations mean in the day-to-day business and operations in the chemical and plastics industry. So for those of you who may not be extremely familiar with the chemical and plastic supply chain, just thought I'd put together a simple flow chart to give you a perspective on how the dots are connected from beginning to end. And basically, as Gene indicated, in the chemical world, we are intimately connected to energy as our source of supply, raw material-wise, but also to operate our facilities. So that energy, oil and gas primarily, in some cases coal and other products, but today mostly oil and gas, get converted into petrochemicals going from the bottom left of the slide. Those petrochemicals become the raw materials and building blocks for other intermediate products like adhesives and plastics and other chemical derivatives. Those derivatives then go to a converter or fabricator network, which become finished goods, and then those are transmitted to us as consumers through some kind of retail infrastructure. So this is basically the simple view of how the supply chain works in the chemical and plastics industry. And believe me, there's many other little twists and turns along the way, but this is just the big picture. So as we look at the marketplace for these commodity raw materials, of course, many of the folks we talk to are in procurement and purchasing functions day to day, and they're very concerned about what goes on with price trends and short-term and long-term. And I started to develop a list of the kinds of things that can impact and influence prices very quickly. And as you can see, all these items listed, whether it's something that's manageable and predictable from operations or from a supply-demand standpoint about the movement of materials from supplier to consumer, it gets to be a very long list of items that can have an impact and influence on price. Then at the bottom you see other dynamics, which some of these can be totally outside the realm of control of many companies, whether it's political turmoil, natural disasters, or weather events, unexpected plant outages, and so forth. The fact of the matter is that all of these dynamics are constantly churning and taking place on a day-to-day basis and having some kind of influence and impact not only on the price of these raw materials for chemicals and plastics, but also on the availability of on the supply-demand side of the equation. So I thought what we would do very quickly, and we're not providing all the answers here, but I just want to illustrate how all this can happen in a business environment, real world, and real time. So for example, recently, within the last 30 to 60 days in Louisiana, one of the major producer companies, Williams, had a fire and explosion at their ethylene cracker down in Geismar, Louisiana. So right away, this is going to have a ripple effect on the industry. But the key thing is, what do you need to know about how this impacts your business? Well, one of the things that we can provide at IHS is a perspective, first of all, on how Williams was situated in the overall industry. So what we're saying here is that their capacity for ethylene represented almost 2.5% of the ethylene total capacity in the U.S. at that time, And then there was also some propylene capacity at that site, which was impacted as well, and that was almost 1.5% of the U.S. Supply. The other information that was critical at the time was what does that do locally and regionally to the operations adjacent to the Williams facility in Louisiana. And what we found out was that Louisiana was actually short of 2 million tons of ethylene. So obviously this was going to further exacerbate that situation and have an impact there as well. Moving on to some of the other issues, ethylene is a major component in several key chemical and plastic products. And what are those? Well, the downstream derivatives that are going to be affected range from styrene to ethylene, ethylene dichloride going into the chlor-alkali business, ethylene oxide, alpha olefins, which go into making products like polymers like polyethylene, polypropylene, et cetera. So all of these downstream products can be impacted to some degree or another. The other aspect of this is what does it mean for the company? Actually, Williams was in the midst of expanding that facility and was increasing the capacity at that site significantly by the end of this year. And what does that mean for those plans? Are they going to be able to stay on schedule? How much of an increase is that, et cetera? And then finally, what does this do to the market pricing? We have to keep track of the price movements for spot and contract prices, and it actually did have a moderate impact on the spot prices for both ethylene and propylene in the U.S. market. So these are very important things from a ground level perspective that can take place day to day based on these unforeseen events that we're tracking and trying to make sure that our clients and customers are well aware of so they can plan ahead. Another interesting situation for the chemical industry that we're watching closely is the weather. We all know that it's impossible to control and manage the weather, but it's certainly something we can monitor and monitor very closely. This is a map of the natural gas operations in the U.S. market. And the reason I chose natural gas is because you can see the high concentration of rigs and drilling activity in the U.S. Gulf Coast, namely Texas, Louisiana, and the adjacent states. And what I would put down there in the bottom with that red arrow is, between June 1st and November 30th, we enter the hurricane season here in the U.S. And as we all know, there's a lot of hurricanes in the past that can track up through the Gulf of Mexico, and those can have an immediate effect on rig operations for both oil and gas drilling, and then the associated downstream chemical and related downstream derivatives of chemicals in that region as well. The overwhelming majority of our chemical and plastics production in the U.S. is located close to those sources of supply down in Texas and Louisiana. So, that's another point that has to be monitored very closely during this time of year to make sure that we know if there's a potential impact to these operations. Something else a little more relevant and timely. Most of us are familiar with the political unrest that's recently occurred in Egypt and the transition of the leadership there. I took this right out of the headlines from last week, and during that tumult and turmoil in Egypt, we saw oil prices jump dramatically over a couple of days, where it jumped $2-3 per barrel on the news of political unrest. And at $100 per barrel, that's a 2 to 3% move in a matter of a couple of days. And as many of you who are familiar with the industry are well aware, oil and gas being the building blocks for the chemical industry and related products, those significant price jumps can have a ripple effect across many products. So what I've highlighted here, and I'm just focusing on the connection between crude oil going through the refining process and how other chemical and plastic products are manifest from crude oil refining and production. All of those products cascading from crude oil are theoretically impacted from a cost standpoint, if you have unforeseen jumps in crude oil price, albeit it may be temporary, but some of these situations can sustain themselves for long periods of time and have a critical impact on the cost structure in the supply chain. So just finally, a couple of notes, since we don't have too much time to go into more detail today. Just some key indications for almost anybody in the chemical and plastics industry. What you need to know and what's important for your business is you've really got to have a handle on the supply chain, and that global and regional events can certainly and will impact your business. Whether you're a global player or a regional player, in today's marketplace, it makes no difference. These global events will impact your business. And you also have to understand what are those weak links in my supply chain, and how can I factor in these unpredictable events that are going to have an influence either on my cost structure, market pricing, or supply chain. So it pays to have a backup plan and multiple sources of supply, as Gene has indicated, and of course it also pays to have a reliable source of information. Obviously, we see that as IHS. So that's it for the chemical portion. I'm going to turn the clicker over to Ryland and talk about the agricultural market.
Thank you very much, Howard. This is Ryland Maltzberger. I'll quickly discuss food supply, agriculture, and some of the weather volatility implications across the different industries here with ag, and how it may affect other parts of the supply chain where you may or may not see it as a direct impact onto your business. In the ag and food supply chain, very similar to what we've seen in chemicals, where there's kind of some direct steps from, let's say, the beginning area of farmer through elevator, producer, processors, finished goods, retailers, and consumers. Obviously, there are some offsets in here where you may see direct from wholesalers. Fresh goods will go through wholesalers and directly to consumers or retailers, and that does change some of the dynamic, and we see more of that in the developed regions going forward as well. Now, as we move forward, and we've seen over the last 5-6 years, we've seen significant volatility and change in price for weather and other impacts globally when it comes to ag. And you may or may not have seen impacts directly on your business. It just depends how close you are. But longer term going forward, we may see more of this volatility that will directly impact you. So like in a historical perspective, back in 2007, we saw low global rice and wheat supplies start to bring up price. And in 2008, we saw higher crude prices feed through to corn. And then the economic crash obviously brought everything back down. And then as we move forward, we saw about 2 years of low volatility, and then another major shoot up with closing of exports out of Russia. For wheat, we saw cotton jump up to significantly 3 times historical average level prices, and that changed some of the dynamics in sourcing textiles. And that's even having ramifications today as it changes global ag policies and just trade policies in some of the major producers around the world, and will change where you have to source some of your supplies going forward. Now, currently over the last year, we also saw a major U.S. drought affecting corn and feed, and this feeds through biofuels, and it feeds through to many different industries, and then ends up affecting policies in developed as well as developing world locations. Similar to what Howard had, what's influencing prices, and that you'll see is in the ag markets, we see obviously the raw material prices, so the inputs that are going into it. But we also see the operating costs, the branding of finished goods, the transportation, a lot of movements around rail, pipelines, and everything around the globe. Supply and demand, obviously with agricultural products, we have more seasonal variables. With South America, you can only produce, during a certain time of the year. Northern Hemisphere, only the other time of the year. So obviously there's delays from one season to the next that's going to affect prices, how long that price stays up, and going to affect how much, the price will remain and how much will drop off with the next supply infusion into the market. And then other dynamics, weather being a very big one, El Nino, La Nino, monsoons in India. A lot of these factors that sit out there and continue to move forward and play havoc on political turmoil and various other industries across the globe. Higher wheat prices, how that affects political unrest, maybe in North Africa, the Middle East, and various other regions. So implications, we have very direct implications, and for some of the clients on the phone here, you've seen some of these where you have year-to-year price variations, you have change in farmer decisions. So if you're selling inputs into the market, use of inputs, capital purchases, long-term financing into the industry, need to increase for revenue protection for farmers and various other input folks in the industry, especially as governments try to do less and less of that to protect the industries. Need for transportation capacity. This actually creates a very good opportunity in many of these regions around the world where some of this food demand will help continue to grow forward. And if we see more increased volatility, it actually becomes an opportunity for some of the industries as you sit out there. And then the indirect impacts of this, very politically destabilizing in developing economies where food budgets remain very large, very dependent on supply, and if it's being subsidized by the government, has direct impact on how the government responds to food security, protectionism, changing imports and exports. Trade negotiations, are very impacted by this. How will the Pacific trade programs and all these go forward? And increased research and development for mitigation technologies. So opportunities, impacts, longer term going forward from ag that are going to affect the supply chain and the way you may invest in the supply chain. So what we're doing within the Agricultural Services Group is actually coming up with a multi-client study that we're putting out information there to get impacts. So longer-term weather variability. So what we're looking at doing is actually seeing some of these trends where we see variability in supplies change on a more dramatic change from time to time. So it becomes more, happens more quickly, happens more often. La Nina, El Nino. We have droughts in North America, Russia, Ukraine, EU. Decreased monsoons in India. What are the impacts of these, and where do these fan out, and where do these hit in your target range of how you're affected by ag and the ag supply chain? Now the participants we're looking for maybe the direct input industries, chemicals, fertilizers, machineries, then anywhere down the food chain as well as it happens to retailers, processors, transportation industry players, banking investments, and then all companies that actually have global risks surrounding change and indirect costs that actually come from ag commodities. And just in kind of a quick summary here before we move forward, you may not be familiar of how you're being directly affected by some of this volatility and how sensitive you may be going forward. But some of the questions that have come up and are coming forward is, are you sourcing metals? Are you sourcing other goods, mining goods? Are you sourcing things from regions where food insecurity becomes an issue, especially with high volatility? Are you resilient to these changes? Are you going to have where your employees may be in countries that where food prices could triple over the course of 1 to 2 years? And so these are the questions that we're bringing up and trying to answer and to put into perspective of how it's going to affect your supply chain and how you respond to it as well. And now what I'll do is I'll pass it along to Roy so he can finish up and give a go forward from here, and thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Ryland, and thanks to all of our speakers. So we'll move briskly into our Q&A period, and we have already had a large number of questions from our audience. So as we approach the top of the hour, what I'll tell you here is that we will conclude our event and very much appreciate everybody who has attended to date. But we will extend our time approximately 5 to 10 minutes longer so that we can accommodate some of the questions. What I would ask is that everybody, regardless if you stay longer for our Q&A period or if you have to drop off for whatever reason at the top of the hour, we would very, very much like you to complete our survey, and we'd like you to provide your very candid and constructive and other comments that you can make in the study because the information is very valuable for us to, like, as I mentioned earlier, not only improve our events, but also understand the issues and topics that are top of mind for our customers and our market out there. So with that, I will also mention to the audience here that I'd like you to consider these opportunities to engage IHS. So as Rylan just noted, that we're going to be taking a look at long-term increased variability of weather and its impact on global supply chains. So that's a multi-client study that they intend to complete in the fourth quarter of this year. So you have an opportunity to directly participate as an organization, and then we would encourage you to do so. And then also, everybody on today's event is entitled to a complimentary subscription to the IHS Pricing Pulse newsletter to stay on top of commodity pricing and price trends throughout the supply chain. And the mechanism for doing so would be to specify in the survey at the conclusion of the event, or as you can see on your console, completing the survey, there's an opportunity to specify your interest in those in the survey. And there's also a way to indicate other interests, for instance, in talking to perhaps Gene Long and his organization about supply chain risk and resiliency. There's other opportunities in the survey to point out areas of interest in engaging IHS. So with that, gentlemen, we'd like to start the Q&A period, and we will start with a question for Gene Long. Gene, a question goes as follows. Earlier you mentioned multi-sourced and how companies need to look at the risks underlying being multi-sourced. The question is, are you suggesting that one supply chain shouldn't assume they are, quote, safe due to being multi-sourced on higher risk materials?
Yeah, I'm going to say absolutely. I think you still have to assume that there's a certain degree of operating risk, even if you are successfully and soundly multi-sourced. And that comes from a couple of considerations. The first of those is, in many industries, and I certainly can't speak to the specifics here, but in many industries, being multi-sourced usually can mean having suppliers of a particular commodity that may in fact be concentrated in a certain region of the world. If that's the case, as we saw recently with some of the flooding in Southeast Asia, your supply could be threatened even if you had a handful of good sources in that area because the infrastructure was crippled for extended periods of time by natural catastrophe and then some of the man-made events that followed there. So that's one example where multi-sourcing may or may not remove risk. It depends on that vulnerability that we talked about earlier. The second case would be even if you've multi-sourced from suppliers who are in fairly disparate geographies, far apart, not apparently independent, they do sell into the industry that you're in, and they probably sell into others. So some of the more macro threats relating to whether or not there's going to be enough trade flow to support you, whether there's enough capacity out there should one of those source areas go away, is still a consideration. So those two are topically the things that come to the top of my mind.
Great, thanks, Gene. I've got a question here that looks like it's suitable for both Howard or Ryland. Maybe we'll start with Ryland. Ryland, there's a question about which region do you believe is at the highest risk between, the question asks, Asia, the Americas, or Europe in the future. Any comments on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as it relates directly to agriculture and some of the related areas surrounding that is that, you know, net importing food necessary regions such as strictly Asia being one of those largest ones, with a lot of the Americas and Europe actually being available or net exporters of food, opens up more risk in developing regions, especially when budgets and, let's say, the consumers that you may be selling products to as well are more dependent upon food as a large part of that. So it's higher risk of selling products into it, but actually a higher risk of them changing policies explicitly around food security and various other things that will have direct impacts, not just to agriculture, but down the stream as well.
Great. Not to put you on the spot, Rylan, but I know we discussed this before. Do you have an example of some of the countries that changed policy in that way?
Well, let's say in the case of, obviously China being one of the biggest up-and-comers or has been for a while now, but they've changed significant policies in ag. In the case of, let's say, cotton with such a high price seen a couple years ago, they've actually incentivized a much higher level than global world prices for cotton individually. And so what this means is it's actually changed, it's trended some of the facilities and the use of it into other regions. So it's actually changed some of the dynamics of where you can source this going forward. Or in the case of, let's say, Northern Africa and Middle East, we've seen higher prices of commodities and maybe changes in money coming in from oil and so forth. But with higher prices of food that's highly subsidized, well, that definitely has direct impacts on some of the unrest and some of the availability of supplies that can help mitigate some of that direct feeling of hostility or so forth.
Great. Thanks, Rylan. So, Howard, we'll turn to you maybe. Do you have a perspective on the highest risk regions, Asia, the Americas, or Europe from a chemical supply chain perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting question from a chemicals vantage point. The interesting thing is that, believe it or not, North America or the U.S. market does pose some interesting challenges, and the reason I say that is because there's a high concentration of operations in a small regional area. So if there are disruptions in a particular part of the country, namely the U.S. Gulf Coast and Mexico, we could see significant impact to the industry. And on the flip side of that, if you have the operations down for a period of time, another deficiency in the North American market is the fact that we're not as import friendly in a lot of cases for downstream products. So it's not so simple a matter to import high volumes of raw materials that the marketplace needs to continue operations. Whereas if you're in Asia or Europe, the operations are more spread out geographically, and they also have a more robust network of trade for a lot of the raw materials. So it's interesting. Here we are in the U.S., seemingly a little more vulnerable in some cases from a chemical industry perspective.
Great. Thanks, Howard. Gene, here's a question for you, perhaps. Do you have suggestions for separating what are considered reasonable risks from black swans? Any thoughts on that matter?
Yes. The black swan issue inevitably surfaces when we start talking about supply chain risk. Experience with many clients over the last 16 to 18 years says that trying to differentiate between disruptive events is probably not the best use of the effort, time, and money when you consider supply chain resiliency or you're designing for resiliency. A black swan is, in fact, one of those things that we can't forecast, and what happens is really bad vis-a-vis the name black swan. Having said that, when I consider the impact of a black swan, what I've really got to do is to consider in the designing or the strategizing of the supply chain operation that I want that can handle that is how disruptive will it be? In other words, how vulnerable am I? And that becomes a very fact-based discussion. And then based on that vulnerability, I try to build the right kind of deterrence, avoidance, or mitigation plan around it. That's not meant to be a very imprecise answer. What it says is that even black swans affect organizations differently. So if you can anticipate that it might be out there, then your ability to sense its emergence and then your ability to respond to it is really going to be the key to whether or not you lose shareholder value or you lose brand image as a result of that thing having occurred. So the answer, sorry to sound like a consultant, but the answer is it depends on how vulnerable you really are to that particular sort of black swan. And our experience says you can definitely gauge that, and it is differently sensed and impacted company to company.
Great. Thanks, Gene. Howard, a question for you. How can companies prepare for the environmental risk of weather added as an aspect of their risk management strategy?
Wow, that's a simple question with a complex answer, but I'll try to boil it down. First of all, in any case, preparation as you're setting up your operations and facilities obviously is key, and major producers in the various regions know the challenges, whether you're in a cold weather region or a warm weather region, or else a region that's prone to unpredictable weather events. Even the physical operations, first of all, have to be constructed such that they can withstand those types of things. Beyond that, as Gene indicated early in his presentation, I think the mapping process to map out your sequence of supply chain events and where the weak links may lie is extremely important. And then beyond that, it's monitoring. I know many companies are keenly aware of developing weather events in the various regions and have a system in place, for advanced warnings so that they can, shut down the operation smoothly and without any catastrophic consequences. And then the other element there is to start back up again smoothly and without consequences. And then simple things like knowing when it's appropriate to maybe build up a little inventory and those sorts of things. So there are many, many ways to deal with this, but be aware, be prepared, map out the process, and all those elements have to be in place.
Great. Thanks, Howard. So we'll take another question or two here. I want to express our appreciation and gratitude for everyone hanging on here as we go a few minutes over. I'll just remind everyone again that please complete our survey and provide us feedback to help us improve and learn more about the market and your interests. And please do indicate if you have specific questions that do not go answered today that you're very keenly interested in on immediate feedback. Do let us know. Gene, there's a question here on having examples of removing complexity in the supply chain. As we add dual sourcing, our complexity has increased. So would you provide some examples of how complexity is removed from the supply chain?
Yeah, I can give a few that are probably very apparent, but maybe not so evident in day-to-day operations. One of the tactics that we have seen our customers and clients successfully use over the years to remove, especially when you're considering risk, it's the old math equation. How many variables can I take out? So very plainly said, if I have a supply chain link that's got, I don't know, pick a number, 6, 5, 10, just call it 10 to be an even number, players or very integral contributors to that particular value chain, one of the first exercises is to see if I can minimize that number. So, a very typical example, to hone in on the supply side is the consolidation or the minimization of the number of carriers, brokers, porters, and other intermediaries that might actually be touching and handling product. Now, that sounds simple, but in many cases I would have to tell you that if you're using transportation links that are not consolidated, you have multiple players you might not even be aware of that are handling and moving your product from source through packaging, through distribution and transport. So that's one particular aspect, and I don't mean to pick on the carrier public or the transportation environment, but there are many that can be considered that are not clearly visible. The other is looking at the information flows, and this is not meant to be a systems critique, but looking at the actual information flows that are necessary to get product moved sufficiently and safely through a supply chain as opposed to what you're currently asking for. We often find that simply through the evolution of time and administrative standards that many of our customers are actually demanding their suppliers to move more data and asking intermediaries to move more data. And a lot of focus in the supply chain has come down to monitoring the data flows, maybe not so much focus anymore on what the data is reporting on. So there are two very typical examples that we see. One is logistical flow simplification, and the other is taking a look at basically getting back to the minimal flows of information necessary to make things happen and to take superfluous information out of the flow.
Great. Thank you, Gene. So with that, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's event, and we still have hundreds of folks online, so I want to point out that we really appreciate everyone staying on extra time as we cover some of this additional Q&A and some of the additional material from our experts today. So this concludes today's webcast, Resilient Supply Chain, How to Dynamically Manage Risk, Opportunity, and Business Continuity. I'd like to thank our speakers as well, Mr. Gene Long, Mr. Howard Rappaport, and Mr. Riley Maltzbarger. Thank you, gentlemen. It was great information, and we appreciate having you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The recording of today's event will be posted approximately 24 hours to the same URL or location that you used to access this event. So if anyone is interested in sharing this with their colleagues or peers or attending the replay that will be available on demand, they can visit anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by visiting the same registration page or hyperlink URL that you used to access today's event, and the winner of our Kindle Fire will be notified within the next 2 weeks. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone joining us worldwide and wish everyone a great day. Goodbye.